AP World, Chapter 29, Question 1. What was the significance of the Korean War in the context of the larger Cold War? The U.S. erred significantly when, concerned about defeating the Japanese, they invited the Soviets to occupy the northern half of the Korean peninsula toward the end of World War II. The Soviets would subsequently install a communist government under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, who would rule over a Stalinist-style state from 1948 until his death in 1994. In 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea in an attempt to unite the peninsula under their rule. U.S. President Harry Truman insisted on drawing a line against communist aggression, consistent with his Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment. Truman orchestrated a UN quote-unquote police action, which in effect was a U.S. military action. The fighting swung dramatically back and forth between communist and American victories. The eventual involvement of the Chinese communists contributed to the war being fought to a standstill. The war represents the first military confrontation between the competing ideologies. It is the first proxy war in which a lesser power is attacked in order to weaken the stronger opponent, thus avoiding a potentially disastrous all-out conflict of the Cold War. It removed any pretense or possibility of the ideologies coexisting. There was no question that there was now a Cold War that would be fought for the ideological supremacy of one side over the other. Chapter 29, Question 2. What were the reasons for Japan's economic success throughout the latter half of the 20th century? The constitution imposed by the Americans on the Japanese at the war's conclusion severely restricted their ability to keep a standing military, a measure that was largely embraced by a Japanese populace eager to turn their backs on the militaristic expansionism that had resulted in such devastation for their country. Because Japan therefore lacked its own military, and considering its geopolitical significance in the context of the Cold War, the U.S. assumed responsibility for regional defense. Because of this, Japan was not burdened by defense expenditures, and thus had more money to devote to building up other aspects of its society and economy. The occupying Americans insisted on the opening up of secondary education to more social groups. The pre-existing Japanese enthusiasm for education intensified, and success in school became of paramount importance to the Japanese. One of the most meritocratic systems in the world developed. The Japanese thus grew a highly educated professional population that would serve as the foundation for incredible post-war economic success. The Japanese government played an active role in encouraging economic growth. Educational expansion played a major role as Japan was able to turn out more engineers per capita than its industrial competitors. Japanese labor was organized along Confucian lines, with group loyalty prized above all. The Japanese system emphasized a mutually considerate relationship between labor and management, resulting in greater productivity and less labor-related disruptions. Chapter 29, Question 3. Why was the Japanese invasion of China good for the Chinese Communist Party? The Qing dynasty fell in 1911, and a new government based in Beijing was formed. The new government struggled to assert control, and most parts of the country fell under the control of regional warlords. The Kuomintang Party, led by Sun Yat-sen, set up a government in southern China, positioning themselves as the legitimate government of China. Initially allies, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party worked together to push back against the warlords, and by the mid-1920s had successfully diminished the warlords' power. Disagreements about political direction caused a rapid deterioration of the relationship between the Kuomintang and the CCP, and from August 1927 to December 1949, the Kuomintang and the CCP engaged in a civil war that the Communists would ultimately win. The Communist success was in large part due to the disruption caused by the Japanese invasion in 1931, at the outset of the Second Sino-Japanese War. During the initial years of the Chinese Civil War, the Kuomintang dominated the CCP so thoroughly that the Communists were forced to flee thousands of miles on foot in an event known as the Long March. Significantly, the only place the Communists could find safety was far inland, in extremely rural areas. When the Japanese invaded, they were necessarily concerned with attacking and establishing control over cities and industrial centers. And because these were the areas under KMT control, it meant that they bore the brunt of the Japanese attack. Meanwhile, the Communists, who had been reduced from approximately 100,000 to 8,000 people on the Long March, were safely ensconced far from the areas targeted by the Japanese. Despite starting from such a diminished position, the Communists were able to take advantage of their relative safety to grow their numbers and train their fighters. The KMT were not able to deliver a killing blow to the Communists because they were now fighting and losing against the Japanese. The Communists eventually gathered enough strength to take the fight to the Japanese, and during World War II were supported financially and materially by the Allied powers. The fighting in China was a fatal drain on Japanese resources, and thus was a crucial factor in their loss in the Greater Pacific War. The KMT and the CCP eventually agreed to a cessation of hostilities in order to focus their efforts on the Japanese. Because the KMT insisted on following conventional military strategy, they were defeated repeatedly and at great cost by the Japanese in head-to-head battles. The Communists, on the other hand, engaged in asymmetric or guerrilla warfare. Not only did this prove to be a more effective strategy, it was far less of a drain on resources when compared with the KMT experience. When the Japanese were defeated, the Civil War resumed, but this time the relative strength of the two sides had become inverted. The now superior Communist forces would defeat the KMT, and in 1949 assumed full control of the Chinese state. Chapter 29, Question 4. Why was Mao's embrace of the Chinese rural peasantry so key to his initial success? The Japanese invasion and the fortuitous happenstance that put the CCP out of their reach was clearly a factor contributing to the resurgence of the CCP. However, it was Mao's embrace of the rural peasantry that provided the basis for growth both during and after the Civil War, Second Sino-Japanese War, and Greater Pacific War. Equally important, however, were the Communists' social and economic reform programs, which eventually won the support of the great majority of the peasants, the students and intellectuals, and even some regional bureaucrats. Long neglected by the policies of the central government, whether pre- or post-revolution, the Chinese peasantry enthusiastically responded to the attention paid to them by Mao and the Communists. Although Mao was born into a farming family, his father was wealthy enough that Mao's upbringing could not properly be called a peasant one. By the time of the Long March, Mao was far removed from that life, having lived and studied as an urban intellectual for decades. He did, however, have a subtle understanding of the peasantry, and he saw in them the potential for a base of power. He was correct, and the support and devotion of the peasantry was key in his rise to and maintenance of power. Mao became enamored of the peasantry, and such was his belief in their superiority over urban populations that he built his policies around them, resulting in the disastrous Great Leap Forward. Chapter 29, Question 5. What was the Great Leap Forward, and why did it fail? In the years immediately after the victory in the Civil War, the CCP set about consolidating their control of China. Once territorial control had been completely asserted and political opposition rooted out, Mao embarked on his long-standing plan to convert the Chinese economy to what he believed was the true communist model. Mao's plan required an inversion of the traditional economic responsibilities. Mao had long been suspicious of urban intellectuals, who he saw as being less loyal to him than his fanatically devoted peasant supporters. His economic plan called for rapid industrialization, not in traditional urban manufacturing centers, but at the hands of the rural peasantry. His reasoning was that 1 million peasants, each engaged in small-scale manufacturing, would be a greater economic success than the traditional manufacturing centers. Mao also sought to impose communist ideology on the agricultural sector of the economy through collectivization. Instead of conceding agricultural production to the traditional rural peasantry, he attempted to bring agricultural production under control of the Communist Party. By putting the responsibility for food production in the hands of party intellectuals rather than the peasantry themselves, Mao triggered a massive famine where tens of millions of Chinese citizens died of hunger. The outcome of the Great Leap Forward were crippled agricultural and industrial economies, setting each years, if not decades, back. The situation was so disastrous that even Mao's cult of personality couldn't insulate him from criticism, and he was moved aside at the top of the state, remaining in relative political isolation until the Cultural Revolution. Chapter 29, Question 6. What was the Cultural Revolution, and what impact did it have on China's development? In the years between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, a group of senior party leaders, later known as the Pragmatists, led China out of the dark years of the Great Leap Forward. These leaders, many of them survivors of the Long March and as such venerated within the party, took moderate, pragmatic steps to rebuild the Chinese economy and state. The disastrous Great Leap Forward led to Mao's removal as head of state, but he remained the most powerful and popular party leader. Mao built upon his persisting popularity throughout the early years of the 1960s, and by late 1965, he was convinced that his support among students, the peasants, and the military would be strong enough for him to launch one last effort to assert his power. Maoist student groups embarked on a wave of violent uprisings, targeting those in society they saw as insufficiently devoted to pure Maoist doctrine. In practice, this meant individuals who had risen to positions of responsibility during the era of the Pragmatists. There was certainly an aspect of score settling to the violence. Mao was happy to have a state of turmoil, so long as it served to empower and elevate him. Mao famously said that he believed that there should be a state of permanent revolution. Some of those around Mao, however, feared that the Cultural Revolution threatened to set China back in much of the same way that the Great Leap Forward had. Mao called off the campaign and turned the machinery of the state against the cultural revolutionaries who had been such fanatical supporters of his. In the first half of the 1970s, up until Mao's death in 1976, there was a vicious struggle behind the scenes for control of the Chinese Communist Party. Those most loyal to Mao competed with former pragmatists for control of the party and, for as long as Mao was alive, were successful. When Mao died, however, the opposition forces no longer had to contend with Mao's mythology and were able to move quickly against the ideologues. Chapter 29, Question 7. What was the Gang of Four, and how did its demise signal a new era for China? 1976 marked the deaths of the two most prominent Chinese communists, Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. In the wake of the destruction of the Cultural Revolution, the pragmatists began to get the upper hand on the purists. It didn't require a close examination to show that neither the Great Leap Forward nor the Cultural Revolution served to advance Chinese national interests. The growing influence of Deng Xiaoping represented a setback for Mao and his closest allies, the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four refers to the group who increasingly contested power on behalf of the ailing and aging Mao after the Cultural Revolution. Made up of Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and three close political allies, the Gang of Four tried to prolong the spirit of the Cultural Revolution and its fanatical worship of Mao. The closing of the Cultural Revolution and the resurgence of the pragmatists threatened the power base the Gang of Four had established during the ideological purge. As long as Mao lived, the Gang of Four enjoyed the cover his prestige conferred upon them, a fact they perhaps took for granted. When Mao died, the Gang of Four moved to secure power, but were quickly overcome by the pragmatists. All four were put on trial, with Mao's wife receiving a death sentence that was later commuted to life in prison, where she would commit suicide. Beginning with Deng Xiaoping, the next generation of leaders introduced pragmatic reforms that would grow China into the political and economic power it is today, all while maintaining the supremacy and dominance of the party. Chapter 29, Question 8. Why were the Vietnamese able to withstand the superior military powers of Japan, France, and finally the United States to eventually achieve independence? The Japanese occupied Vietnam as a prelude to the Greater Pacific War. Though some viewed the Japanese as Asian liberators, freeing them from European colonialism, the nature of the Japanese occupation turned many of the Vietnamese against them, and by the end of the war, the Viet Minh were working actively to help the Allies against the Japanese. The Vietnamese expected their efforts to be rewarded with post-war independence, but the French were determined to reassert their colonial rule. The resulting war between the French and the Vietnamese is referred to as the First Indochina War and lasted from 1945 to 1954, culminating with a devastating French loss at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. As a result, Vietnam was divided between the Communist North and the Western-backed South. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were as a result all granted their independence. In the aftermath of the French withdrawal, there was a struggle over who would be the official government of Vietnam. The U.S. favored the South, but was wary of unilaterally forcing a government on the North. The U.S. proposed a national democratic election to determine which side would be recognized as the legitimate government. When it became clear that the Communists were the understandably overwhelming favorites to win, the U.S. canceled the election. The subsequent insurgency against the unpopular South Vietnamese government would eventually grow into the Second Indochina War, called the Vietnam War in America and the American War in Vietnam. The war would end with victory for the North Vietnamese and the withdrawal of U.S. forces. This is despite the fact that total Vietnamese deaths are estimated to be as high as 3 million, whereas American deaths are closer to 60,000. The reasons for the Vietnamese victory boil down to one thing. The Vietnamese will to fight was simply stronger than that of the Americans. Key factors include the Vietnamese were fighting for their homeland, whereas most Americans had never heard of Vietnam prior to the war. The Vietnamese had been fighting on their own territory for 20 years prior to the major escalation of hostilities by the U.S. in 1965. Their personnel was experienced and battle-hardened, and benefited from material support from both the Soviet Union and China. Vietnamese strategy was tailored for their climate and terrain. U.S. strategy for conventional warfare proved to be less effective than it had been in World War II or even the Korean War. As the war dragged on, popular support for it in America shrank to the point that Richard Nixon campaigned in 1968 on a promise to get America out of the war. The vast majority of U.S. troops had been withdrawn by 1972. North Vietnamese forces overran the South Vietnamese positions and by 1975 seized control of South Vietnam.